Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, a pretty fascinating and crucial topic, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS. We've gathered a bunch of sources to really dig into what this organization is all about.
Yeah, and our mission today is to give you a much clearer picture of CSIS, its origins, what it's actually mandated to do, how it operates, how it's structured, and importantly, some of the key events and, well, controversies it's been involved in.
Yeah.
Think of it as your guide to Canada's main civilian intelligence agency.
Exactly. National security comes up all the time, right?
Yeah.
But the agency actually doing the intelligence gathering, both here in Canada and abroad, often stays sort of in the shadows. Okay, let's unpack this then. Where did CSIS actually come from? It wasn't always CSIS, was it?
No, definitely not. CSIS itself was established on June 21st, 1984, but its creation was really a direct consequence of the MacDonald Commission. His report came out in 1981.
Right, the MacDonald Commission. I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, it looked into some, well, pretty serious allegations of improper, even illegal activities by the RCMP Security Service. That was the body responsible for security intelligence before CSIS existed.
Ah, okay, so it was part of the Mounties originally.
Exactly. And the core finding of the MacDonald Commission was basically that mixing policing law enforcement with security intelligence work was risky. It blurred important lines and opened the door to potential misuse of state power. So the big recommendation was separate them. Security intelligence needed its own civilian agency.
So it wasn't just a name change, it was a fundamental shift in thinking about how this should work in Canada. And this new agency, CSIS, it had some key differences baked in from the start.
Absolutely. The law that created CSIS included some really crucial oversight mechanisms right from day one. Things like needing judicial approval, judges sign off for certain warrants, especially the more intrusive stuff.
Which makes sense. Civilian agencies, civilian oversight.
Right. And it also set up review bodies for external scrutiny. Initially, that was the Security Intelligence Review Committee, SIRC, you might have heard of them, and also an Inspector General's office. Now, those specific bodies have changed over time, but the principle of external review was there.
Okay.
And while the official act was passed in June '84, they really got up and running, de facto, around mid-July, under the first director, Thomas Darcy Finn.
Okay, so a deliberate move towards civilian control, judicial checks, oversight built in. Got it. Now, what exactly is CSIS mandated to do? What's their job description, basically?
Well, their primary job is gathering, processing, and analyzing national security information. That's the core. But it also includes conducting what they call covert action.
Covert action, what does that entail?
It can mean various things like gathering intelligence using secret methods, maybe influence operations or other actions done quietly without public knowledge, but always within their legal framework. And they can do this both inside Canada and internationally.
Okay. And who do they answer to?
They report to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and they're subject to ongoing review nowadays that's mainly done by the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, NSIRA.
NSIRA.
Right.
Yeah.
They replace SIRC and the IG.
Essentially, yes. NSIRA has a broader mandate now, looking at basically all national security activities across the government, not just CSIS.
And the really crucial distinction you mentioned before is that CSIS has no police powers, right? They can't arrest people.
Absolutely critical point. No law enforcement function. That stays firmly with the RCMP and, provincial and local police forces.
So when CSIS first started back in the 80s, what were the main threats they were looking at?
Initially, a big focus was countering what foreign intelligence agencies were doing here in Canada. So counter-espionage. Our sources mentioned, for instance, Chinese economic espionage as a key example early on.
But that seems to have shifted over time, especially after 9/11. Oh, absolutely. Post 9/11 saw a huge pivot. Counterterrorism became maybe the top priority. The cases involving Mar and Omar Khadr, while very controversial and complex for other reasons, definitely illustrate that period and focus.
But things change again, don't they? It feels like the focus has swung back recently.
It really has. In recent years, there's been a very noticeable return to focusing on threats from state actors. You had the CSIS director in 2021 warning specifically about China.
Yeah, and that 2023 intelligence assessment calling Canada a high-priority target for Chinese interference, using things like incentives and punishment. That sounded pretty stark.
It did, and the government responded, the 2024 Countering Foreign Interference Act actually amended the CSIS Act to give them more explicit powers to investigate and push back against foreign interference.
So the threat landscape is always shifting, and CSIS has to adapt. You also mentioned a difference between security intelligence and foreign intelligence. Can you clarify that?
Sure. Security intelligence is mostly about threats to Canada's security, think terrorism, espionage against Canada, subversion, that kind of thing.
Mm.
Foreign intelligence is more about gathering information about foreign states, their political activities, economic plans, military capabilities, etc. Things that might affect Canadian interests but aren't necessarily direct threats to Canada's security in the same way.
And CSIS does both now.
Well, the law was updated in 2016 to explicitly allow CSIS to collect foreign intelligence abroad. Before that, it was more focused domestically or on security threats wherever they originated. And we shouldn't forget their role in security screening, for government jobs, immigration, airports, critical infrastructure. That's a big part of their work, too.
Right. And legally, where can they operate?
Okay, so for security intelligence threats to Canada, there's basically no geographic restriction legally. They can collect it anywhere. They can use publicly available info, data sets the minister approves, and significantly data mainly about non-Canadians outside Canada.
Okay, that's a pretty wide scope. So how is CSIS actually set up to do all this? What does the organization look like?
Well, the main headquarters is in Ottawa, naturally. But they have a significant footprint across the country with 6 regional offices. Atlantic and Halifax, Quebec and Montreal, Ottawa region, Toronto region, Prairies based in Edmonton, and BC out in Burnaby.
And what do those regional offices do?
They're really important. They liaise with provincial and municipal governments, the private sector, community groups. They do outreach. And crucially, they maintain contact with their counterparts in the U.S., especially given the shared border and intelligence concerns.
Makes sense. And the top leadership, how's that structured?
You've got a director, of course, then typically deputy directors overseeing big areas like operations, that's the collection and analysis side.
Yeah.
Then administration and finance, and another for policy and strategic partnerships. Think long-term planning, liaising with other agencies. Reporting up to them are assistant directors for more specific functions. Collection, requirements, which sort of defines what intelligence is needed, legal services, very important, technology, human resources. There's also a chief audit and evaluation executive for internal checks and a senior officer for disclosure of wrongdoing. So internal accountability mechanisms, too.
And I found that interesting CSIS officers can carry guns in foreign flashpoints, but not in Canada.
Yeah, that's right. It kind of underscores that distinction. Again, they're primarily an intelligence agency here, not law enforcement. The rules are different when operating in potentially dangerous environments abroad.
Right. And how do people become intelligence officers? Is there a specific track?
Yes, there's a formal training path. New intelligence officers, or ISOs, go through the Intelligence Officer Entry Training IOET program in Ottawa. That's followed by a 3-year professional development program, which includes a mandatory posting in Ottawa for part of it. They're on probation for at least a year, and there's support for foreign language training, which is obviously pretty critical in this line of work.
And what about the analysis side? Taking all the collected info and making sense of it.
That's primarily the job of the Research, Analysis, and Production Branch, usually called RAP. It was reorganized back in the mid-90s to work more closely with the government's Central Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, the folks who produce those big-picture intelligence reports for policymakers.
And RAP itself is divided up.
Yeah, typically into subdivisions focused on the main areas. Counterintelligence, so dealing with spying against Canada, foreign intelligence analysis, counterterrorism analysis, and then distribution, getting the finished intelligence product to the right people in government.
Okay, comprehensive structure. Now, CSIS isn't working alone, right? Who are their key partners internationally and domestically?
Internationally, they are Canada's main player, specifically for human intelligence, or HUMINT, within the Five Eyes Alliance.
Right, the Five Eyes. That's Canada, US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand.
Exactly. It's a very deep and long-standing intelligence sharing partnership going back to the UK-USA agreement after World War II. Now, there's often speculation you hear about CSIS officers maybe being posted undercover in Canadian embassies abroad to collect foreign intelligence, but our sources don't actually confirm that with hard evidence. It's plausible, but not officially stated.
And within Canada, do other departments do intelligence work?
They do, but it's usually different from CSIS's mandate. For example, Global Affairs Canada has its own Security and Intelligence Bureau, but they tend to focus more on overt information gathering, diplomatic reporting, and protecting Canadian personnel and embassies abroad. The Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, also has intelligence units focused specifically on border-related threats.
So distinct roles.
Yeah, distinct roles, though they obviously need to coordinate. CSIS works very closely with the RCMP on national security investigations where policing powers are needed, and they share relevant intelligence with many other government departments as required.
Okay, switching gears slightly. CSIS has its own badge, a flag, and even a nickname.
Huh? Yes. They got a proper heraldic badge back in the mid-'80s with royal approval, and they actually raised their own CSIS flag for the first time in December 2016, featuring that badge.
And the nickname.
Well, according to the book The Mosaic Effect, internally, apparently, some staff refer to the agency as the Sisters.
The Sisters, really?
Yeah, quite a contrast to the serious public image, isn't it? Makes you wonder where that came from.
Definitely memorable. Okay, we've touched on oversight, but let's dive a bit deeper. How is an agency with these kinds of powers, often working in secret, actually held accountable? That's crucial in a democracy.
Absolutely fundamental. As we mentioned, the main review body now is NSIA, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. They have a pretty broad remit across government. But things got a significant boost, or overhaul really, in 2019 with new national security legislation.
What did that 2019 legislation do?
A key thing was creating a new role, the Intelligence Commissioner. This person reports directly to Parliament, not just the government, and has quasi-judicial powers to oversee and authorize certain national security and intelligence activities. It adds another layer of independent scrutiny.
Okay, so NSIR reviews, and the Intelligence Commissioner provides specific oversight. What about Parliament itself?
Parliament's main oversight comes through the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, known as NSICOP. This is a committee of MPs and senators who all have security clearances. They review the overall legal framework, policies, finances, and activities related to national security.
So they get a look inside?
They do, but it's important to note NSICOC is technically an agency of the executive branch, overseen by the Prime Minister's office, even though its members are parliamentarians. It's a bit of a hybrid structure.
Interesting structure. And our sources mentioned something about a secure bunker.
Right. Reportedly, senior CSIS officials used a secure bunker somewhere in Ottawa to meet with federal court judges to discuss and file applications for those sensitive warrants we talked about earlier.
Wow. That really paints a picture of the secrecy and the judicial process involved.
Okay,
Now,
no agency like this exists without bumps in the road, right?
hmm?
CSIS has faced some major controversies. Let's get into some of those.
Indeed. And some of these have been really significant, raising major questions. One of the earliest and arguably most devastating was the 1985 Air India Flight 182 bombing.
A horrific event. What was CSIS's connection?
Well, CSIS faced intense criticism afterwards. They had been monitoring Sikh extremist groups suspected of plotting violence. They had wiretaps. They had informants. Yet the bombing wasn't prevented.
And wasn't there a huge issue with destroying evidence?
Yes, a massive issue. The fact that CSIS erased 156 wiretap recordings related to the investigation, well, it was seen as incredibly negligent, possibly worse, and it definitely hampered the investigation and subsequent trials. There was also poor coordination between CSIS and the RCMP at the time. And an informant was involved.
Yeah. Adding another layer, one of the key suspects, a man named Surjan Singh Gill, who pulled out of the plot shortly before, was actually a CSIS informant. The Crown prosecutor, the courts, they were scathing about the destruction of the wiretaps, noting they could have been crucial for either conviction or potentially proving innocence.
And the fallout.
The first director, Ted Finn, resigned over the scandal. It was a major blow to the young agency's credibility.
Okay, then fast forward a few years. The Grant Bristow and Heritage Fund situation. That sounds really problematic.
Oh, it was deeply troubling. Between 1988 and 1994, CSIS contracted a private investigator, Grant Bristow, to go undercover in far-right groups.
Standard enough, maybe?
Except Bristow didn't just infiltrate. He became a key figure, helping to form the white supremacist group, the Heritage Front, and acted as a leading organizer.
Yeah.
Serious questions were raised about whether CSIS was essentially creating and maybe even funding the very group it was supposed to be monitoring.
That's crossing a line, surely.
It certainly raised huge ethical and operational questions. Then in the late 90s, you had Project Sidewinder.
Chinese foreign influence again?
Yeah, it was a joint RCMP-CSIS project looking into alleged Chinese influence networks in Canada. But it became controversial when the RCMP publicly accused CSIS of watering down the final report, suggesting CSIS was maybe downplaying the threat level found in the investigation.
Internal disagreements spilling out. And what about dealing with the courts? You mentioned warrant issues earlier.
Yes, that's been a recurring theme, unfortunately. Accusations of CSIS not being fully transparent with the courts when seeking warrants. There was a very significant case in 2013 where federal court judge Richard Mosley strongly censured CSIS, finding they had deliberately misled the court.
Deliberately, why?
Apparently, it was to allow partner agencies, potentially the Communications Security Establishment, CSE, to spy on Canadians abroad, using CSIS's warrants, without the court fully understanding the extent of the cooperation or who was doing the spying. That's a serious breach of the duty's candor owed to the court.
And this connects to other accusations about mishandling evidence.
It seems related, yes. There were allegations around 2009, for example, that CSIS hadn't disclosed to the courts that some of its confidential informants were actually considered deceptive or had failed polygraph tests. Things like that undermine the reliability the intelligence presented.
Okay, another major case people will remember is Maher Arar. What was CSIS's role there?
The Error Commission, which investigated his rendition to Syria and subsequent torture, actually absolved CSIS of direct involvement in the rendition itself. It found that inaccurate information passed by the RCMP to U.S. authorities was the main problem.
But there was still criticism of CSIS.
Yes, the commission did criticize CSIS, suggesting the agency needed to be much more critical and cautious about using or relying on information that might have come from regimes known to practice torture.
And that issue information from torture came up again, didn't it?
It did, quite prominently in 2009. There were seemingly conflicting statements made in court by a CSIS lawyer versus what the CSIS director said publicly about whether the agency could or would use information obtained through torture.
That sounds like a major policy confusion or contradiction.
It caused quite a stir. The director later issued a clarification, but the controversy lingered, and he announced his retirement not too long after. It highlights just how sensitive and ethically fraught that issue is.
We've also seen criticism of the actual quality of CSIS intelligence.
Yeah, Barbara Jackman, a prominent national security lawyer, has been quoted describing some CSIS research as potentially sloppy and suggesting officers can sometimes suffer from tunnel vision, maybe focusing too narrowly on a suspicion without considering alternatives.
And then, more recently, some very serious internal issues have surfaced regarding workplace culture.
Yes, this has been deeply concerning. Starting around 2017, allegations emerged from former employees like Huda Mukbil and others about experiencing racism and homophobia within CSIS.
And it escalated.
It seems so. In 2023, things came to a head with extremely serious allegations, including rape and claims of a toxic work environment, specifically within the BC regional office. This prompted CSIS to launch an external workplace assessment.
What's been the response?
Well, CSIS announced they're creating an ombudsman position to handle internal complaints and have committed to publishing annual reports on harassment and wrongdoing. Steps towards transparency, but clearly addressing deep-seated cultural issues.
Then there were accusations about payments to former terrorists.
Right, in 2018, allegations surfaced that CSIS had knowingly paid money to individuals who were former terrorists but had turned into informants. CSIS initially denied it quite strongly in public statements. But the director later had to testify before a parliamentary committee and essentially acknowledged that, yes, in some specific controlled circumstances, payments had been made to individuals with such backgrounds to gain intelligence.
A very fine line to walk. And finally, the most recent major international incident involving CSIS intelligence
is undoubtedly the fallout from the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in BC in 2023. Prime Minister Trudeau stood up in Parliament and accused agents of the Indian government of being involved, citing Canadian intelligence widely understood to mean intelligence collected or analyzed primarily by CSIS.
Which has obviously caused huge diplomatic tensions.
Massive tensions. It really underscores the high-stakes nature of the intelligence CSIS deals with and its potential global impact. And just briefly on leadership, it's worth noting most CSIS directors have been political appointees, though some have come up through the ranks or had previous law enforcement backgrounds. There's an interim director right now.
So looking back at everything we've discussed, it's quite a journey. From its creation out of RCMP controversies to its evolving mandate dealing with everything from Cold War espionage to terrorism to foreign interference and navigating all these serious controversies along the way.
It really is. It paints a picture of an agency constantly adapting, facing complex threats, but also grappling with the immense challenges of operating with secrecy and significant powers within a democratic framework that demands accountability.
Yeah, that tension seems central. The need for security versus the need for democratic oversight and respecting rights.
Exactly. It's a perpetual balancing act. You need effective intelligence to protect the country, no question.
Hmm.
But you also absolutely need robust oversight, transparency where possible, and adherence to the rule of law and civil liberties. The evolution of NSIRA, the Intelligence Commissioner, the Parliamentary Committee, they all reflect that ongoing effort to get the balance right, often learning hard lessons from past mistakes.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive and thinking about the future, more complex threats, technology changing everything, what's the final thought you'd leave our listeners with regarding CSIS?
I think this whole history really forces us to consider the ongoing and maybe even intensifying ethical tightropes that agencies like CSIS have to walk. How do they stay effective against sophisticated adversaries, state actors, terrorists, cyber threats, while strictly adhering to democratic principles and the law? And maybe just as importantly, what's our role as citizens? How does public awareness, informed debate, and yes, critical scrutiny help ensure these powerful agencies remain both effective and accountable? It's something we all need to keep thinking about, I believe.